Drug developers, investors, researchers, and corporate executives wrestle weekly to understand what is happening in commercial development of NASH medications. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Stephen Harrison, patient advocate Donna Cryer, liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, and forecasting and pricing guru Roger Green as they discuss the issues affecting the evolving NASH market from their own unique perspectives on the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast.
For everyone with an interest in NASH or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up, episode 37 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami. The summary of papers from the final day of AASLD 2020 starts now. Okay, the Digital Liver Meeting, known as TLMDX if you like your acronyms, or AASLD 2020, wrapped up about half an hour ago. And we are here today to discuss some of the excellent presentations from today and a couple from yesterday. Donna is still on assignment. We're hoping she'll be back with us tomorrow for the wrap-up. But Stephen is back from his family festivities. Stephen, how did the birthday party go?
It went great. My wife turned 55, and I think she was happy with everything that transpired, and it was a good day. Thank you for allowing me the time off.
You make it sound like I've got powers I never even imagined. Thank you. That's very kind. And happily, we're joined by Dr. Mary Ranella. Maru, how are you today?
Great. How are you? Thanks for the invite.
Thanks for joining us. Maru and Mazen Noureddin co-chaired a panel this morning that had Louise and I texting each other back messages. Just went, wow. Yeah, wow. Yeah, wow. Louise and I are each going to talk about a presentation from that panel, which was titled NAFLD and Non-Alcoholic Steatohepatitis Clinical. But mostly it was about different observations of patient populations and subsets. Really just eye-opening. Far more, really, really eye-opening. So at any rate, it's only 9:30 p.m. right now as we're recording in the UK, where Louise is. A totally civilized hour for the rest of us, so I assume we will all be sharp throughout the podcast, and any giddy laughter you hear will be because we're enjoying ourselves and not because we're too punch drunk to do any better than that. So with that, let's get started. One more change in the icebreaker. What I'd like each of us to do is talk about the one most important or eye-opening thing that we heard or saw at this conference. It's got to be one. It can be big, it can be small, but it's got to be one. Brave one, go first.
I guess there really isn't just one observation. I would say that once again, we've been sort of struck over the head with issues related to placebo responses and histologic endpoints, and just again underscores how we need to solve that problem.
Amen. Next.
I was struck by one of the presentations today on tesamorelin, which is a growth hormone receptor hormone agonist, I guess. And the comment that the endocrinologist that was giving the talk made an impression on me. All the omics work that they've done, looking at gene expression profiles, and the new gene, not new gene, but one that is a potential target that, to me, prior to the meeting, I didn't know anything about. It was CSF1. And just identifying that is a signaling pathway that modulates macrophage function in livers, which is it's an exciting area that I think is going to be exploited more moving forward. And maybe not just by that company, but by others because of the work that they've done. It's exciting. It
is. My only reservation, though, with that is that it's, again, another sort of anti-inflammatory approach. We haven't seen a whole lot of success with that, but maybe that will change if it's a bit higher up. I don't have a good idea of where that is in the inflammatory cascade.
Maru, wasn't it work done in human NASH and not just a rodent model of NASH?
Yes, I believe it was. Yes. Yeah.
So maybe there's something to it, and I would venture to say that as we work through different therapeutic modalities in NASH, like with any disease, we get better and better at it. And I think, even some of these second generation ASK1s potentially have purpose. Their binding affinity is better. Maybe they're more potent. They stay on, I don't know. But at the end of the day, whether it works or not alone, there's always the opportunity for combination therapy. And I think it's just exciting that there's something new genetically to talk about as far as a target.
Yeah, the growth hormone story is not new, of course, right? And it's very interesting. My concern would be specifically with that drug, though, that I believe it's actually been associated with growth and other things like tumors. So I don't know. I would want to look at that very carefully.
Yeah, I think, the other thing there is they've only focused on HIV, fatty liver and HIV patients, and they don't really have data on novel, just straight up non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. They did mention there's an ongoing study with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Whether or not that actually proves to be beneficial, I don't know. I guess I'm just more excited about the CSF1 target, and maybe there are other mechanisms that can inhibit that besides growth hormone.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to step in front of Louise just because you teed it up. I think the thing that struck me the most was the paper that Naeem gave last night at Late Breaker about semaglutide, Firkostat, and cilofexor. Reason being that Stephen has argued passionately, as only Stephen can, that if we really were going to go forward like it mattered, we would start doing combinations with all the drugs we believed in most, instead of taking things that we didn't believe in all that much and seeing what happened when you slam them together. This feels like more the second than the first. I mean, people believed in SEMA, but a 72-week mono trial that has no impact on fibrosis, even if it has NASH resolution, that's kind of troubling. And cilofexor and Firkostat, I hadn't heard people getting that excited about. But you put the three of them together and you get some really fascinating results in terms of percent reduction in liver fat. And it leads me to think that this whole combination area might be more subtle and complex, but also more fruitful than you would think if you had to just take things and slam them together from the get-go. So I was really excited about that. I didn't talk about it enough last night, but that was really the one that jumped me. Louise, what you got?
What I've got is everything that everyone said has been very exciting, very promising, and we're heading into that world. But I was struck by the poster by Jeffrey Lazarus and the team, a global review of national NAFLD and NASH policies. So we're doing all of this work, and it's fantastic work, but not one country has a NAFLD strategy. And that was 83 countries in the world as of July the 9th this year. So does it matter how much work and effort we put into trying to stop people dying of liver disease if not one country actually has a strategy or significant guidelines to actually implement all of this hard work? So that's what I'll take away, is that we really need to get people to wake up and smell the coffee, just like it's written across Stephen's shirt. But it's amazing.
Well, hey, listen, if Donna were here, she would have lots of comments on that particular abstract, because I think that's one of her areas that she's very passionate about, for sure. And I will say this, you have the task force chairman for AASLD's Fatty Liver Task Force on our webcast.
Yeah, no, I was actually going to say exactly what you said. Donna is going to be and would have been instrumental because she's really involved with policy change and very interested in that. And in fact, just this week, she took a next step to sort of helping guide us into making some of those changes, so see how AASLD can support her basically in making those changes, and we can work with her together. I mean, it's critical that there be a government platform at least, or a statement on things like this. And I think, to start with, I mean, we can talk about, pediatric, children basically, and the effect of their diets on their disease and risk of obesity, diabetes, so on and so forth. And that's something that, was actually initiated a couple of years ago and has since stopped, but hopefully will be taken up again.
I keep threatening to do an episode called How Did the Liver Fare in This Election? And we may actually get around to it now that we think we know what happened in the election, or it might wait for the Georgia runoff like everything else. We'll see.
Roger, wasn't there a presentation, Maru, was it in your session where I guess the guy from Inova came on and talked about nutrition?
Yeah.
Louise is going to talk about that paper today.
Yeah.
Actually.
Okay.
In fact, Stephen, when I said that Louise and I were texting each other back and forth, wow, yeah, really, wow, it was that paper.
Good. I thought that was excellent work.
Yeah, I did too. And by the way, if I hadn't chosen what I chose, when I said one, I boxed myself in, but the other one was, Louise has talked on the podcast a lot about the importance of starting with education, and education is really where you solve this problem. And after you look at the pediatric NAFLD paper this morning, which demonstrates that it's really prepubertal. It's what happens in the liver pre-puberty that really sets the course for the rest of life. And that's got to entirely be about educating parents and kids when they're young. So, Louise, I've always thought you were really wise and interesting ways of looking at things, but I thought you were a lot wiser after the 143 paper this morning, if possible, than the year before that. And we'll talk about all that in the next hour. So with that, why don't we get started? Okay, the rest of the program is pretty simple. One at a time, each of us will take a presentation or poster we've been looking at, take about 5 minutes to talk about what's in it, and then the rest of the group will comment and ask questions, and then we'll go on to the next one. And Louise, I wasn't going to do this because you've done it the last 2 nights in a row, but since Stephen's comment, why don't you start with the PAIC paper? Why don't we do that one first?
Yeah, we can do that one first. And it was in Mary's session. It was abstract number 141, and it was diet-related mortality among non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, data from the Global Burden of Disease 2017. And it was presented by James PAIC, who I think was the lead biostatistician at Inova. So what they did was, obviously we know that NAFLD's very common and a complex disease, but in the setting of obesity rising and type 2 diabetes increasing, what they wanted to do was look at maintaining proper weight through healthy diet, physical activity, as we know is normally what we all advise to as our mainstay of treatment. You lose weight, do more exercise. So what he was doing was looking to assess the associations of metabolic and dietary risk factors with liver mortality due to NAFLD across the country and the world regions. So took the data from that report. So they looked at the Global Burden of Disease provides epidemiological assessments. They took 359 diseases and injuries and 84 risk factors through 195 countries and territories, as well as the 7, I think it is, major world regions from 1980 to 2017. The data they collected was the publication estimates of death from liver cancer and liver cirrhosis due to NAFLD, death attributable to metabolic and dietary risk factors. And the dietary risk factors included things like low intake of fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole nuts, grains, seeds, milk, fiber, calcium, seafood, omega-3, fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, as well as high intake of red meat, processed meat, sugar-sweetened beverages, trans fatty acids, and sodium. So the data collection also then went on with metabolic risks, included high fasting plasma glucose, high low-density lipoprotein, LDL cholesterol, high systolic blood pressure, high body mass index, low bone mineral density, and impaired kidney function. The socio-demographic index, so the measure of the average income per capita, educational attainment, total fertility rate of the country level, and is also available, was in the GBD study. So they took all of that. They then combined the liver cancer and cirrhosis deaths due to NAFLD to understand the burden. So statistically, to analyse the data, associations at the country level were determined using unadjusted and socio-demographic index, adjusted partial Spearman correlation coefficients, multivariable generalized linear regression with gamma distribution, and independent risk factors were identified by bidirectional stepwise selection with a significant level of entry at 0.2 for stay and 0.5 on a multivariate GLM model. So the results, they split into 2 sections, one of which was what was the current burden of NAFLD, dietary and metabolic risks, and he went through 3 sections for this. So the age standardized rate of liver death due to NAFLD in 2017. So globally, there were 184,905 deaths due to NAFLD, accounting for 8.6% of liver deaths from all chronic diseases, liver diseases. And it had an ASR, an LDL NAFLD of 2.32 per 100,000. The highest burden of NAFLD was observed in Andean Latin America, Central Central Asia, Western Africa, and Southeast Asia. They then went on and looked at age standardized rates of deaths attributable to dietary risks in 2017, of which 10.9 million deaths were due to the dietary risks and accounted for 19.5% of all-cause mortality. The age standardized rate of deaths attributable to dietary risks is 140.24 individuals per 100,000. The highest burden was observed was in Central Asia, Oceania, Eastern Europe, South Asia, North Africa, and Middle East. So the final section of that age standardized rate of deaths was attributable to metabolic risk. So 17.6 million deaths due to metabolic risks, accounting for 31.4% of all cause deaths. So the age standardized rate attributable to metabolic risk was 228.99 people per 100,000. And the highest risks burden areas there were Oceania, Central Asia, Southern Africa, Central Africa, Eastern European and North Africa and Middle East. So they then looked at the next set of results was how is NAFLD associated with metabolic and diet risks. The diet correlated with NAFLD in the context that they identified that if you had a low content diet of Mediterranean foods, so if you had low fruits, low diet in vegetables, low fruit and nuts, high red meat, things like that, that you were more likely, those were the dietary risks associated. And the metabolic risks were high fasting glucose, systolic blood pressure, high body mass index. So they looked at all of those, but diet correlated with NAFLD. But when they actually adjusted it for the social demographic index, there was no statistical difference, suggesting that it was likely to be the diet choices, the living location, type of diet available, income, educational level, rather than the diet itself that may be the contributor to the NAFLD there. And the strongest risks of liver deaths were due to NAFLD in the Spearman partial correlation coefficients between death rates of NAFLD when they were attributed. It was in high sugared beverages. Also, impaired kidney function came out as a really high risk, and also high body mass. So ultimately, their key takeaway points were that in addition to the known metabolic risks, dietary risks were independently a drive for global burden of NAFLD. The data could inform policymakers to determine appropriate policies, guiding awareness on how to best manage one's diet and increase NAFLD liver deaths, which would be helpful if any one of those 83 countries actually had a NAFLD policy, then that would be good. But the risks most correlated with NAFLD liver deaths were those low in components of Mediterranean diet. The highest correlation was the intake of sugar-sweetened beverages, and the high intake of trans fatty acids was associated with a 3% increase in liver death due to NAFLD, even after adjusting for metabolic risks. So that was the abstract that I thought was well presented, with some startling figures of populations affected, and just the sheer numbers per 100,000 is unbelievable. So that was our wow factor. So I thought it was well done.
So first of all, thanks, Louise, for really summarizing that quite nicely. The moment at which we started wowing each other was about the moment at which it became obvious how bad the problem with the sugar-sweetened drinks was. About to sit down with all my kids and talk to them about my grandkids, frankly, who were young enough that they're in that zone. And in one case, the parents could probably manage the kids' diet a little better than they do. And now I've got data to prove that it matters. But I thought that was a remarkable paper. And Louise, I agree with you. It would help if anybody had policy around this. Mary, you were actually, I think that was your group. And I don't remember the Q&A as well as I should. I know you took a bunch of questions on that, and I don't remember them exactly.
Yeah, there weren't a ton of questions, but I will say that I thought it was remarkable and really important, and sort of drives home the point that the macronutrient content of our diet is important. I think it's incredibly important to educate parents to feed their children better, because even, children as young as 2 years of age, when they're obese, can get streaks in their coronary arteries. And these are things we can prevent. I took a little bit of exception with the continued reference to Mediterranean diet specifically, because it being a global paper, I think it was a little bit confusing. In fact, Arun made a point about this as well. At the end of the day, there are certain components of the Mediterranean diet that we know are heart healthy and favorable from a diabetes metabolic standpoint. And I think that should be an important emphasis policymaking and just in our own clinic and practice as we educate our patients and their children.
I had a similar reaction to the Mediterranean diet comments, which is I was trying to figure out how well that adapts to some parts of the world. If you wanted to take this literally, what would you do in sub-Saharan Africa to eat a Mediterranean diet?
Exactly. So you need to basically, it needs to be contextualized to each, region. And it's not a Mediterranean diet per se, right? It's just a diet high in polyunsaturated fatty acids, not terribly heavy on carbs and, lean protein sources. which give you exactly what you need, which is low saturated fat, low trans fat, or no trans fat, really. So I think that I would have probably pitched it a little bit more like that. But.
And I agree with you. Trans fat was the other thing that jumped out at me. Just amazing, just amazing.
And I think what came across, and I know it's a global study, but I think it leaves us with social, political, and health dilemma. We plan fast food restaurants in 2.5 time concentration in lower socioeconomic areas. And if you don't have a lot of money, you can feed your child for £1 or $1 for chicken and chips, you're going to do that. So we deliberately put in their way a low quality diet. And I think where I see that, or where I've seen it with startling thing, is in Australia. Aboriginal health and Aboriginal communities in rural areas don't get access to great quality foods to be able to choose from. But there's a really good program out there, which was by, I'm trying to think of the lady's name, where they chose to use a community-based project where they themselves chose what foods were in the areas. They introduced concerted interventions in 2018 where the stores worked. They improved the number. They looked at the range and quality of relative price of fresh food and vegetables, lean meats, whole grain cereals. They even promoted healthy takeaways because their sugar intake in the children in the recent surveys is astronomical, and they have such a problem with diabetes, obesity, type and cardiovascular, and it's not helping. So I think there's a lot of work needs to be done, and that's what struck me from this paper and some of the global reports, that we're not helping.
Yeah, and it's a tough nut to crack, right? Because it's not just, that they have quickest access to very high caloric density foods that are inexpensive, but they don't really, they maybe don't have the luxury of either, having not, being able to go to the grocery store often enough to where things can last that are fresh, that they don't have perhaps the education or the cultural background and traditions to teach them how to cook and prepare those things. And so it's a tremendous amount of education needed in addition to policy that fosters, healthy eating, essentially.
And in fact, there was a review of why fruit and veg was priced way out of their affordability range in rural settings, whereby all fast food was the same price as the cities. So there is, don't know whether it's been completed, a governmental review on policy and prices in rural settings. So Amanda Lee was the professor who is doing a lot of improving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nutrition and health. So they've got some good projects, but they own it, and that's the important part. So maybe local communities have to own what gets given to them by councils and planning, I suppose, but it's tough.
We have to start somewhere. So I think education is critical.
So, Stephen, you had mentioned, we jumped this the first in part because you mentioned how interesting you found it that Louise Meroux I have not mentioned as part of what you found striking about it.
I think you covered everything. I mean, it was just an eye-opener for me. I mean, we kind of intuitively think this sort of thing, but now it's data driven. Now we actually have data to support it. So, I mean, I think the three of you did a fantastic job of reviewing the highlights from the presentation. I'm anxious to see the publication so we can dive into a little bit more detail and chew on it a little bit. But it was a fantastic presentation.
Yeah, it's super interesting. They're going to be limited, of course, with the level of granularity that they're able to discuss. But again, I think it more than anything just peaks, and brings the importance of these macronutrients to the forefront. We believe very strongly in the impact of diet and macronutrient content, and we put together a company that Stephen is part of that aims to do a sort of granular analysis of dietary macronutrient content for two specific purposes. One is to help understand response in trials, whether it's the placebo or the drug treatment response, by having granular patient data on macronutrient dietary content and activity. And then the other is on the patient side to really help guide people and, give them advice, in order to eat better and live longer.
It's theoretical, right, Meroux? I mean, you guys have been using this in the clinic. Yeah,
we've been using it in the clinic. So it's also very motivating for people. It helps give them a concrete, plan or schema to help them understand where their deficiencies might be or what they're doing well with.
was going to say, and potentially, again, just circling back to the presentation today, we talk about lifestyle modification, we talk about weight loss, we talk about eating foods and exercising more. And in the setting of clinical trials, that is discussed with the patients, but there's no real way to measure the success that each individual patient has or does not have relative to the guidance that's been given to them, other than to say, did you lose weight or did you not lose weight? But I think there's more to the story than just weight loss. And I think it's alluded to in the presentation today that macronutrient content is critical. And I think that's one of the things that's missing from these studies, and potentially this application that could be brought forward to measure that nutrient content at the beginning of a study, during the study, and potentially at the end of a study, maybe even just at the beginning, at the end, would be informative if there is actually a placebo response, and could it be due to that lifestyle change that occurred, yet it wasn't intuitively obvious that there was a change happening.
Or is there an augmented or attenuated response in the treatment groups too?
Much to explore, and it sounds like a fantastic application. So where shall we go next? I'm thinking, Stephen, why don't we go to you next? We haven't heard from you in a couple of days.
So, look, my charge here is to talk about Late Breaker 23, which maybe a bit unfortunately, it's a poster and not a presentation, because it's the results from the phase 3 Resolve It trial, which is a very large phase 3 trial with elafibranor for the treatment of NASH. So the poster really summarizes the surrogate efficacy analysis from the Resolve It trial, which was a pivotal phase 3 study in patients with NASH and predominantly F2-3 fibrosis. So just by way of a quick background, elafibranor is a PPAR alpha delta agonist. We talked about this a little bit on the podcast Saturday night about the different PPARs. And ultimately, we got to the phase 3 because of positive results from the phase 2 Golden study, which demonstrated histologic improvement in patients following treatment with 120 milligrams of the dose for 1 year. So this was a double-blind randomized placebo-controlled study in which patients with NASH with a NAFLD activity score of 4 or more and fibrosis F1 to 3 were randomized in a 2-to-1 fashion to receive elafibranor 120 milligram or placebo. So it was only one dose versus placebo. They were required to have a baseline liver biopsy or one within 6 months of screening. And entry criteria were standard across all phase 3 trials. They had to have well-controlled diabetes, stable doses of vitamin E for 6 months prior to randomization, excluded if they had evidence of cirrhosis or significant alcohol intake or other chronic liver diseases. Then they had to have weight loss less than 5% in the preceding 6 months. And if patients were on PPAR gamma agonists, other PPARs to include fibrates, GLP-1 agonists or SGLT2 inhibitors, they were excluded. The surrogate efficacy analysis was performed at week 72, with the primary endpoint being resolution of NASH without worsening of fibrosis. Biopsies were read centrally by a single hepatopathologist. Key secondary endpoints included the percent of patients with improvement in fibrosis of at least one stage, and in keeping with the mechanism of action of elafibranor, changes from baseline in lipid and glucose parameters. So you might ask how many people were enrolled? Well, I have that for you. 1,070 patients were included in the intent to treat set, which was limited to patients with F2 and F3 fibrosis. So there were 717 for elafibranor, 353 for placebo, who underwent paired liver biopsies. And baseline characteristics were generally well balanced. 60% male, 50% diabetic. A third of patients had BMIs over 30. 60% of people had NAFLD activity scores of 6 or more, so indicating a lot of activity in these patients histopathologically. There's a 50-50 split between F2s and F3s, and I think this will become an important point of conversation as we move along. No significant imbalances with regard to ethnicity, medical history, and CONMED use. So how well did it do? Well, elafibranor did not meet the primary endpoint of resolution of NASH without worsening of fibrosis. The response rate was 19.2% compared to placebo response rate of 14.7%. The response rate for elafibranor was consistent, however, with expectations based on the phase 2 trial. However, the placebo response was higher than anticipated based upon the data that was available at the time the power analysis was conducted. The key secondary endpoint of improvement in fibrosis was also not met. And we can talk about, again, why that was. And it was predominantly because the placebo response rate was high, particularly in relation to other large trials where fibrosis improvement in the placebo group hung around the 12 to 13% range. It was much higher in this study. Also evaluated across a number of subpopulations. However, there was no clearly defined benefit in any specific subgroup. In keeping with the metabolic effects observed in previously conducted studies, elafibranor did demonstrate a favorable impact on triglycerides and non-HDL cholesterol. And there were also favorable effects observed on some liver biomarkers like ALT and GGT. So although the efficacy analysis were not what I guess we had hoped for, the drug was safe and well tolerated, and its utilization is being continued in other liver diseases like primary biliary cholangitis. So at this point, I think we can just wrap up and say that elafibranor did not meet its primary and key secondary endpoints in the study, and we can maybe have a debate about why that was. I think one of the things that Maru brought up at the beginning that was very interesting was this whole notion coming out of this meeting about placebo response. And I didn't mention it in my brief review of the presentation, but I do want to highlight that the elafibranor had a 24.5% improvement in fibrosis of at least one stage without worsening of NASH, but the placebo group had a response of 22.4%. So why is that? And I think it's important to have that discussion, because if you look at obeticholic acid, for instance, and you look at the results from their phase 3 trial, they hit statistical significance, but they didn't have any better response to OCA on fibrosis than elafibranor did. It was about the same. The difference was the lower placebo response with the REGENERATE trial. I think that's worthy of a discussion, because so many of these drugs are kind of being forced out of development because of the placebo-adjusted response rate not hitting a target number. And this drug is safe, it's well tolerated, it does have some positive impacts on some metabolic syndrome factors such as triglycerides, and who knows how it might behave if put in combination with others. But I think some of these issues need to be resolved moving forward, and gaining a better understanding of that placebo response, particularly with fibrosis, is going to be critical, because it doesn't just apply to elafibranor. We see high placebo response rates for tropifexor that was presented today by Dr. Sanyal. We saw it with semaglutide. That paper is now out in New England Journal of Medicine. And so my thing I wanted to just mention related to that is this idea that if you tease apart stage 2 fibrosis and its response rate to placebo and stage 3 fibrosis and its response rate, we saw from this meeting, in particular with aldafermin, that the response rate to placebo is higher in F2s than it is in F3s. And that got me wondering, and actually I've asked GenFit to go back and look at their data, knowing that 50% of the patients were F2 and 50% were F3. Was there a different placebo response rate between the 2s and the 3s? Because the way we quantify fibrosis currently is semi-quantitative, and you don't get partial credit. So we do know that the collagen content for an F3 patient is significantly higher than an F2 patient, and that's not the same linear relationship between necessarily an F2 patient and an F1C patient, for instance. And so could it be that there's not enough difference to always distinguish an F2 from an F1C? And could it be that the inter and intra-observer variability, or the staining, or just the variability of the second biopsy was not able to identify the same level of fibrosis? And it's not necessarily that the drug worked or didn't work. It's just the way we interpret the the biopsy. So I think I'll stop there and see what you guys have to say about that. And you might think I'm completely off my rocker, but I think it is worthy of a discussion.
I have a comment. So I completely agree, Stephen. It's a major issue. And I wonder now, of course, if you have an incredibly potent intervention, so say, for example, you do bariatric surgery and you lose, 20% of your body weight, as we saw with the bariatric surgery paper published recently in Gastro, you have 85 or so percent NASH resolution rate compared to much less in placebo. So if you have a highly powerful drug, it's not an issue. But I'm wondering if there's any way it would even be possible to have a lower level of a lower threshold for drugs that we were sort of pinning as being for future combination use. Because what we do want is drugs that are well tolerated, just like elafibranor was incredibly well tolerated. And from a potency standpoint, I don't think anybody would say it was a terribly potent drug, but in combination, it may be an excellent drug. And the bar, would really be great if it could be a bit different for those sorts of drugs.
So when we're done talking about this, I'm going to go into the aldafermin late breaker, which actually went back to the aldafermin data we talked about yesterday and separated F2 and F3. You very clearly see dramatic differences in placebo levels between the two. And I agree with you. To me, one of the interesting things is that F2 is where you want to, in theory at least, focus more on metabolic and the entire galaxy of metabolic diseases and the spectrum of metabolic diseases and conditions. And if that's the place where we don't have tools that are good enough to manage placebo effect in the ways that Stephen just described, it will be very difficult for us to identify drugs that have stronger effects on NASH than they do in other metabolic elements if your placebo rates are going to keep skying. I think it'll be interesting when lanifibranor gets to phase 3 to see what happens there, for example, because they did quite well in phase 2. And as drugs are developed over time, people talk about how the market is in F2, there's a need in F2, but it may be hard to find drugs in F2.
I mean, so just look at Arun's presentation on tropifexor, another FXR, non-bile acid FXR. The two doses, when you look at improvement of fibrosis by 1 point or more without worsening of NASH, was 26 and 25%. Again, in line with what we see from a much larger study with another FXR, beta-cholic acid, and the data I just presented with elafibranor. But the placebo response rate here was 21%. Again, much higher than what we saw with OCA, higher than what we saw with selonsertib in the Stellar 3 and Stellar 4 trials. Remember, with Stellar 3 and Stellar 4, that was just an F3 and an F4 population. No F2s were included in that analysis. So I think it's just worthy of a discussion. Maru made an excellent point that you have drugs that dramatically move the needle in fibrosis or in NASH resolution. It kind of becomes a moot point because you are able to overcome the noise of the biopsy and the placebo response rate. However, it's hindering us a bit in our ability to identify drugs that maybe metabolically have an impact or that have an impact clearly with drug, but because of the placebo response, they're not moved forward in clinical trials. So the combination idea is one that I think we may be limiting ourselves when we think about combos because we kind of have a way of discarding drugs that don't meet their endpoint. MSDC0602K, which is a mitochondrial pyruvate carrier, it blocks pyruvate entry into the mitochondria. It doesn't necessarily bind PPAR gamma directly, but it has effects on PPARs, all the PPARs. There was a dose-response relationship with that drug that unfortunately didn't hit its endpoint, and so it's not being carried forward. You could make an argument that seladelpar, because it didn't hit its PDFF endpoint, and that was a presentation we talked about earlier, it did have a dose-response relationship on histopathology, but nobody's talking about that drug separately. We do need to analyze this a little bit more carefully and improve our tools that we use to measure response. I'm not knocking the pathologist here. We definitely need them and need their help in moving this forward. But I do think we have identified some areas where we need improvement. And I think that might be a more granular way of determining the amount of collagen content, particularly between a 1 and a 2.
So I'm going to use that as a bridge, since I'm supposed to talk about two different papers tonight. We're already 45 minutes in, to talk a little bit about the F2 versus F3 issue with aldafermin, Stephen, that you just raised. I'm going to see if I can make this half a presentation in this context, right? So we talked about this last night. We looked at cohort 4, 24-week trial, and demonstrated that aldafermin met its primary endpoint, 0.7% reduction absolute liver fat versus 2.7 placebo, 39% relative versus 13, 68% of patients had a greater than 5% absolute reduction versus 24, and 66 versus 29. But this was a study where there were 78 patients in the entire cohort. And when you took a look, 44 of those were in F2 and 33 or 34, I guess, were in F3. When you lay those two up against each other, you get very different results. So, for example, in terms of patients exhibiting greater than 5% reduction in absolute liver fat content, the placebo group for F2 was 31, the placebo group for F3 was 12, right? So the aldafermin group for F2 was 74. The aldafermin group for F3 was 61. So as a result, both had significant changes, but placebo starts from a much higher place. If you look at the 30% relative reductions in liver fat, you see the same thing. 38 placebo versus F2 versus 12 placebo F3. So you get 74 in F2 in the aldafermin group, 56 in the placebo group. Same thing again. The amplitude of effect is greater in the F3 group, but the height of the placebo tends to obscure. Now, it goes back to Maru's point, which is that that's a good enough drug that F2 is able to show significance even in the midst of that. But here it gets a little dicier. Okay. Fibrosis improvement greater than one stage, no worsening of NASH. And this gets exactly what Stephen was talking about with F1C versus F2. The F2 group had a 31% antifibrotic response in the placebo group versus 0 for F3. So the aldafermin response is 41, 44 versus 31, 13. I'm just eyeballing the sample size of 13 and 27. I'm going to guess that's not significant. In the F3 group, 0 placebo, 30 for aldafermin. I'm going to guess that is significant. So that would be a case where the kind of question you were asking about Ella, Stephen, would very much come into play, right? I think that there are a few others. That's the one that comes most readily to my mind. You know the paper better than I do. So you might be able to think of a couple more, but that really does make the point when you start getting into fibrosis measurements, right? You're going to get robust results, but the results will consistently have a much tougher bar in F2 because the placebo controls are going to be so much higher. And yeah, that could eliminate some valuable drugs. And when I go back to my reaction to the semaferkostat cilofexor paper, you realize that products that might not be brilliant in their own right might have a place if we don't rule them out, for the kind of reasons you're talking about. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. If you guys want to spend more, we can, but I think that amplifies the points you've been making about the importance of either learning how to analyze F2 patients better or coming up with some different ways to measure.
Look, I think we need to get a better way of analyzing it, because what I don't want pharma thinking is that they can only study F3s. See, so when you see results like the aldafermin paper you just described, the presentation you just described, it makes people want to focus on F3s because, oh my gosh, maybe our drug doesn't work as well in F2s. I'm not sure that's the issue. I think there's a problem with the way that we interpret the results in F2. I don't necessarily an issue with your drug not working in F2, because there's no difference between, in my mind, there's no biological plausibility to explain why a drug would work better in an F3 than in an F2. Now, I could make that argument the other way for F4s. You know, once you develop portal hypertension and all the inherent complications of cirrhosis, even bariatric surgery that Maru alluded to in that paper she commented on, it didn't move the needle in F4s after 5 years of losing massive amounts of weight. So that is a different animal. But I'm not sure there's a lot of biological difference between a solid F3 and a solid F2.
Right, but except that the content, the collagen content can be so varied between those two. And I mean, the issue, again, is based on our categorical interpretation of fibrosis stages when trying to describe what is a linear process. And that's why we keep getting stuck. And I think that, the AI methods are going to really help us with this. tips if, we get them a little bit more into the mainstream of these studies.
Absolutely. We need to use this as a continuous variable.
It strikes me in some ways that that's not a bad bridge to go into talking about the SEMA paper.
All right, sure. So, this is an important paper. It was presented by Phil Newsome. Oh God, yesterday or the day before. Days are kind of running together for me a bit, but it was a 320 patient, 72-week randomized controlled trial with people who had an NAS greater than or equal to 4 and included people with F1, 2, or 3. There was an adjustment to the statistical analysis plan, and essentially the patients that were analyzed for the primary outcome were only the F2, 3 patients, which were 230 patients. So just a little bit more granularity on that group of patients. 43% of the overall population was F3, but 69% of this particular population that was analyzed for the primary endpoint was F3. So this is a highly enriched F3 population. Now, their primary endpoint was NASH resolution without worsening of fibrosis, and they also looked at fibrosis reduction with no worsening of NASH. So just some general comments on the results before we get into the details. I was struck by a lack of a clear dose response on several things, but including NASH resolution. There was something unusual, I think, that happened in the 0.2 milligram group on multiple measurements. But in any case, that was, I think, largely driven by the response in the 0.2 milligram that wasn't much better than 0.1. May just be it's just not enough of a difference in the dose to make a significant impact. Moving on to sort of NASH resolution, which is the primary endpoint, this was striking. The SEMA 0.4, and that's kind of what I'm going to focus on because that's really the dose that worked the best, certainly. 59% had NASH resolution. This is really one of the highest NASH resolution rates we've seen. We see similar numbers in efruxifermin data and then lanifibranor, and I think that in and of itself is interesting. Placebo response in the NASH resolution endpoint was 17%, which is, slightly generous, but not completely out of the range, but certainly on the high side. Where I was really struck, though, was in what happened in the fibrosis reduction by 1 point group. So 43% of the SEMA 0.4 milligram group met this endpoint, but 33% of the placebo did, right? And that is just completely outrageous. It's normally we're thinking in the 20% range. If you think about the 43% response in the 0.4, that is much better than is seen in the majority of studies. That being said, I think that we haven't really seen a very convincing antifibrotic response in any of the GLP-1s. In the liraglutide paper, the LEAN trial, not only was that a very, very small study, but that difference in the fibrosis response was largely driven by significant worsening in the placebo group, which I thought was not completely believable. So I'm mostly convinced that a lot of what we see with semaglutide is really related to its weight loss. In this trial, the 13% of the 0.4s was 30% weight loss in the 0.4 milligram group, which is a lot of weight loss. So I don't know. So that's I think what the biggest driver of response is. Of course, there are multiple theoretical reasons why GLP-1s should help NASH. I'm not so sure that's bearing out, though. And one last thing I want to note is that they did have a very nice response with respect to NASH resolution in addition to fibrosis reduction, in 37% versus 15% in placebo, which I think is exciting and important. But I'm a little confused about the disconnect between NASH resolution and fibrosis reduction over time. I'm a believer that happens, but if you look at the bariatric data, there is continuous improvement up to 5 years, which we might see with this. Again, less so in the more advanced stages of fibrosis. But maybe we can just discuss a little bit.
Yeah, I think the encouraging piece of data that is consistent in this study is there was less progression of disease. And I think that was encouraging. These discrepancies we're seeing in fibrosis improvement relative to NASH resolution. And so that's why we're not seeing a fibrosis benefit. Look, the study was 18 months in duration. If you're defatting the liver, ultimately we should see improvements in fibrosis. I think there was improvement in fibrosis. There was less progression of disease. This comes down to the inconsistencies in reading the histopathology, the slides. One of the things we have speaks to a bigger problem in NASH that we are on the precipice of trying to resolve. But we need to get a better way of uniformly reading these slides. Now, we're not to the point where artificial intelligence is going to replace semi-quantitative assessment. We're not there yet. We're moving in that direction. But until we get there, how do we help these companies that have drugs that make sense, that are actually doing something positive to patients, either through weight loss or through improvement of histology? How do we help them make sense of the results? And I think it starts with a very clear, uniform way of reading these slides, understanding the kappa coefficients, understanding the fact that maybe one pathologist isn't enough, but how do we get at the right answer? Is it rereading the baseline slides like Sirius did to eliminate temporal bias? Is it clearly defining what an F1B, 1C is versus a 2? I think, we need to work through these things. We need to say, look, if two pathologists are going to read these slides, do they read them independently and only adjudicate the differences? Which,
that's what I did here, right? I mean, and the other thing that was striking is that only 24% of the time did the pathologists agree on all of the different components, which I thought was disconcerting. I mean, not surprising, really, but a bit disconcerting. 24%, and then there was adjudication, of course, that happened after that. But it's, it just.
But what we don't know, Maru, was how did that adjudication process occur? It's like when you and I talk, you've got the louder voice, so I always get drowned in the conversation.
In fact, what I was exactly thinking is what you're saying. So I was wondering if there's one pathologist that had more of an influence on the other, and if they were systematically either downgraded or upgraded based on who, I don't know. They're obviously going to publish that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that there's a lot that we don't understand, but I think people are trying very diligently to understand this disconnect between NASH resolution and fibrosis improvement. And I honestly think it's not a function of the drug or the mechanism. Livers don't take sides, right? I mean, if you're defatting the liver, if you're improving the underlying substrate that the liver is living in, I think intuitively the liver is going to get better. We've shown that with Hep C, Hep B, autoimmune hepatitis, drug-induced liver injury, and alcohol. You get rid of the insult, livers get better. And if we're attributing the insult here to free fatty acids and we're making that better, I don't understand, I honestly think fibrosis is getting better as well. And this is the third time I've alluded to it in this discussion. Progression of disease did not happen at the same rate as it did in placebo. So
that was a very important difference, without a doubt. I think that at the end of the day, we need, especially in this type of a mechanism, which again, I think is mostly driven by weight loss and defatting the liver, you need to wait more time to show decisive, differences in fibrosis improvement. And that's, 5 years, that's what you need in Hep B, Hep C, and in the bariatric data too. You get much better responses at 5 years.
So here's a really naive question from a guy who's, as I admit, most like this last natural science course was high school biology. One of the presentations I was looking at, and it may actually have been a sales pitch that somebody was making, I'm not sure, talked about the difference between not only level of fibrosis, but what's happening as fibrosis is progressing versus how it's regressing. Is there a chance that part of what we're not getting under the hood on is something different within the collagen itself or the fibrosis itself that would help us get a little more clearly scientific around things like, Stephen, your comment about it wasn't progressing in one group as fast as another? Is there subfractionation or some kind of sub-analysis of collagen that we haven't gotten to yet?
Actually, that was discussed by Arun in his presentation to some degree with tropifexor today, where they looked at artificial intelligence and actually showed that the evolution of collagen deposition behaves opposite than the resolution of collagen. And that was actually a quite intriguing finding that I was not aware of prior to this meeting. So maybe that's actually an important getting back to the very beginning when you asked what is one thing that struck me as being important from the meeting, this is also one of those. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm wondering if something like a technology, like HistoIndex, for example, looking at different types of collagen fibers, and if we could glean something important with respect to that, looking at the fibrils and their thickness and their type, for example.
If I'm remembering correctly, that was a histoanalysis and it was Arun's paper. It was a HistoIndex analysis that he was using to do that. So maybe all these pieces start to converge a little. And I've got one more paper to talk about, so we should do that. This was my wow paper. Thanks to Donna for talking about how important this paper was likely to be. So I got to pay a lot more attention to it than I would have otherwise. Basically, I'm going to talk more about the idea than the data. I'll talk a little bit about the data. But the idea is that liver formation during pre-puberty is more rapid, and it has much more to do with formation of liver than what happens during adolescence. So that if you have fatty liver disease in such a way that you slow development and mitochondrial formation depletion pattern in prepubertal kids, I did that right, good, prepubertal kids, affects progression of PNAFLD and probably will wind up affecting what happens in adult life. So these were folks from Montefiore and Einstein in the Bronx. And what they wanted to do was take a look at the underlying mechanisms driving progression in PNAFLD, believing that oxidative stress and inflammation were among the key factors. But in children, rapid liver growth, a major difference from adults, and what that might mean for PNAFLD was something they wanted to explore. Okay, so the hypothesis fundamentally is that, as I say, what happens during the first 12 years can affect the DNA damage response, and if that happens, if DNA integrity is lacking in mitochondrial nuclei, then cells don't survive or proliferate appropriately, and that kind of damage will ultimately affect ploidy and polyploidy, and it will lead to challenges that may not be easy to overcome later in life. Going back to why education may be a lot more, I understand now more than I did this morning about why education is so important. So they wanted to look at the state of DNA synthesis and cell proliferation during normal liver growth in children, and then to understand what the consequences of hepatic injury would be on those patterns, particularly involved in obesity-related PNAFLD. So they had in Einstein, Pediatric Fatty Liver Clinic in the Bronx. They had obviously demographic and clinical data, and they had liver samples in a biorepository of 100 annotated biopsies from kids under 12 and adolescents 12 to 17. They then went to an NIDDK-funded database and got controls of 6 to 8-year-olds and 6 to 8 healthy 14 to 17-year-olds. And they scored tissue based on kind of the typical measures, right? Steatosis, ballooning, inflammation, fibrosis. And then they looked at cell proliferation, cell growth, arrest patterns, ploidy, and finally mitochondrial DNA depletion. So the first interesting thing is that if you simply looked at fatty liver and NASH in the prepubertal and adolescent cohorts, you got roughly 60% of the cohort was fatty liver and 40% was NASH, 61-39 prepubertal, 57-43 adolescent, but that's not significantly different. In fact, that's just not different, okay? However, if you then went in and looked at where the NASH scores came from, what you saw was that ballooning and steatosis was not significantly different between the two groups, but ballooning and inflammation were. And using my high school science understanding, my understanding is that ballooning and inflammation really are the things that lead to damage and stress over time and fibrosis and those kinds of issues. Therefore, you'd want to look deeper and understand what was going on. And what they identified is in the healthy prepubertal livers, there was a far lower number of DNA copies, that would be, if you will, incomplete DNA ploidy separation, than in the adolescents. But when you looked at the people with the kids and adolescents with liver disease, the prepubertal levels of mitochondrial depletion were significantly higher than they were in the adolescents, significantly at a 0.05 level, numerically by a factor of about 3. Okay, so where that took you is to the idea that there was more fibrosis in the prepubertal population than in the adolescents, again, significantly. And as a result, interestingly enough, the duration of obesity was shorter in the prepubertal population. So on the one hand, you've got more fibrosis, you've got more liver damage in a shorter period of obesity. And what they then went in and looked at was ploidy distributions among healthy subjects and in PNAFLD. And among the healthy subjects, what you saw was that the under 12s had a higher level of healthy fissioning, and the over 12s had a lower level of healthy fissioning, or fissioning really. But when you went into the the children with PNAFLD, you found that fissioning happened far less frequently, successfully in the kids and more so in the adolescents. So what they inferred from all that was basically that damage will be created to the liver because you will get incomplete mitochondrial formation, much more depletion. Cells will not form healthily, and as a result, kids will go into adolescence damaged or with their livers damaged. And over time, that may make it harder to reduce obesity in adolescence, and generally sets the liver on a bad path in life. Now, I'm not sure I'm explaining this as well as I might, but I think the point's pretty clear, which is if you don't get this right in kids, you will create a problem for the child's liver that will play out in a whole bunch of ways as the child gets older. Everything else gets harder to do right. And I don't think I had appreciated, at least, the degree to which childhood liver formation under the age of 12 was really setting a path for the rest of life. And put next to the PAKE paper, it becomes really a siren call to work aggressively in all those 83 countries that don't have a plan on how can we help kids when they're younger eat healthier. You know, you think about all those sugar cereal ads on kids' TV and, you know, reliance on sugar and fast food, trans fats. And you say, we're putting our kids in a penalty box from which it will be very hard for them to recover. And that was why Louise and I kept going wow to each other as we were watching these presentations. I was pretty staggered, and I'm done. Thoughts, comments, questions?
Yeah, I think it's important. It's very hard to study children pediatric disease because it's rare to see biopsies, and they really did a really good job of that. The one thing I will say though is that there's definitely selection bias in the sense that, you know, for you to bring yourself to do a biopsy on a child, your pretest probability is high that there's something significantly wrong going on, especially in a young child. So I would say that's the only thing that I think is important to contextualize a bit.
So I know that point was made during the presentation, and I was thinking about it, and the question I had, and I don't know the answer, you're more likely to, is how much harder is that to do in a child than an adolescent?
Well, it's hard operationally because you need to put it under general anesthesia. I mean, that's part of it, is that children, to do anything to a child, you pretty much need to sedate them, like really, really sedate them, which is an increased risk. Then you have the parents, which understandably are protective and they want a higher burden of proof before they allow you to, skewer their child with a, 16 gauge or maybe smaller needle, I suppose you could do. But it's a higher bar. So
a higher bar for a 7-year-old than for a 14-year-old?
Much, much, much more. Yeah.
Okay. That's the context.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
The prevalence of fibrosis, any significant fibrosis in that age cohort is actually really low. I think that what they reported, which I think was 40% NASH or so, right? That's way out of what the actual background prevalence is. I think that's just the people that they selected to biopsy.
But not all of whom have fibrosis. Okay.
Oh, no. Fibrosis is an even taller bar. Yeah, even less likely.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the fibrosis, one of the epi papers around this meeting suggesting that when you got down to it, about 2% of prepubescent kids actually have fibrosis.
Yeah.
Population number. So yeah, that's right. There's a lot higher than that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that highlights to me is, when designing trials, it's hard right now to design paired liver biopsy studies in kids. We know they have disease. Is it exactly the same? Probably not. I think there's data to suggest the pattern of diseases may be a little bit different. However, it's still something that needs to be addressed. And one way to address it is exactly what we talked about in the other presentation, which is getting after lifestyle modification. But for a lot of people, access to foodstuffs that they can afford are the kind that give them fatty liver disease and metabolic overload. So we do need to get to a point where we can do clinical trials in pediatrics as routinely as we're doing them in adults. But I think until we get to a non-invasive endpoint, we're going to be challenged by that. To me, this highlights an area of unmet need, understanding the biases that are probably inherently in place here.
That makes sense. I think there's also a vast policy issue here, right? If you take a look at what the government at least the U.S., I'm sure I doubt it's that different in other places, but the U.S. government, by how they design food stamps and children nutrition projects, the kinds of things that you can buy if you want to get as much satiation as possible under those programs that are allowed you are all the wrong things. I've had experience to look at this recently, and the things that people buy and they say, well, you can get them with food stamps, are exactly the wrong things to be feeding your kids.
Oh, it's even more clear in Texas, right? So Little Caesars Pizza, you can get a large for $5. That'll feed the whole family. Mm-hmm. And so if you look at the demographics of San Antonio and you pick the higher socioeconomic locations, there's no Little Caesars. You go to the lower socioeconomic parts of town, they're on every street corner because it's, maybe not the best pizza in the world, but you can get a large for $5 that feeds a whole family. And I think that's replicated over and over and over again in our society.
Yeah, and we're still, the biochemistry, the chemistry of taste, right, is that, so one of the things I had to learn to lose 50 pounds is that when I did that 20 years ago, is that the flavors that we gravitate towards are sugar, fat, and salt. They're the easiest flavors for your tongue to grab. Now, what they do is they wipe out everything else in the food. You lose all subtlety, you lose all value, and over time you become deadened to what good food is because you can't taste through it. But that's exactly what Little Caesars is. And if you take a look at those formulas, the sodium levels are off the wall on that stuff.
Yeah, but I'm not the one to talk to that because, as Maru will tell you, I'm a meat and potatoes guy. And, trying to get me to enjoy a nice salmon with, broccoli is going to be challenging. So,
but maybe it has to do with what you were accustomed to eating when you were a kid, Stephen.
That's true. That's true. Although I grew up in kind of a rural farm area of Mississippi where we basically ate what we killed and grew in the garden.
Well, yeah, maybe not.
Everything from rutabagas to broccoli to okra, and I don't know.
When you were growing up there, what was the luxury meal? What was the thing you fantasized?
Well, that's really going to, put my life in perspective. So it was going to the Western Sizzlin to get a sirloin steak. Mm-hmm. Once a month on Wednesday when kids could eat free.
I knew the answer had steak in it. I was completely confident. Yeah, for that reason, right? Which is that you grow up thinking, I'll know I've succeeded when I can eat all the steak I want. I've had people say that to me. And then, they have heart attacks and they got to figure out what to do about it. But so it's a complicated set of issues. But what we don't do is we don't teach the society to aspire to food that will help you live longer and better.
One thing that I've noticed, I'm Mexican, and so my background is a bit different. And when I was raising my kids, my children ate what I made, and that was just it, right? And so I would tell my friends, they would give their kids, mac and cheese or chicken nuggets, and they would have a whole different meal for themselves. That's part of the issue is that we start feeding our children things that we think are kid foods when they're not kid foods, right?
They're bad
gross, really. So I don't know. I think part of it is just we need to train ourselves to understand that, the kids' palates can be shaped from an early age. So
not to go all the way back to sociology, but a lot of that has to do with do families eat dinner together?
Right.
I was a joint custody single father for 7 years. I had my kids every other week. And it was really important to me that we had dinner together.
Yeah.
Dinner was our hour. So maybe I probably believed in the food pyramid too much and served them too much starch, but they were good meals. There was nothing I put in front of my kids I didn't put in front of myself because that was the valuable hour of the day. And I think as we've devalued that hour, we've set up exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. And I think there's an awful lot of evidence around that. I think when you eat in front of the TV, you eat quicker, you don't digest your food as well, you lose the conversation. So we moved in the 80s to white plates, which meant plates lost a lot of pattern. Food portions became larger. And to be fair, when I went to the US for the first time, I just couldn't believe the portion sizes. Ours were large, but oh my Lord, I could have eaten for a week on a portion. And I think we do. And our children see what we eat now as normal. So they're going to supersize it as well. But for me, it's education. Do we need to add education of our bodies into the whole education system? I know there'll be a lot of teachers that scream and shout, but honest, we come out of school not knowing how the most important machinery that we're ever going to be in contact with ourselves works, or how we can look after ourselves. And schools may well have to be the area that picks up children that are obese, particularly in these younger ages when they're most at risk, because they never present very often, though the majority certainly don't present to GPs. And I really don't believe that people feed their children to put them at risk of premature death knowingly. And I think that's what we're facing. I just thought on these sort of figures, where we're heading in 20 or 30 years' time is just beyond even my comprehension. And that's not a lot.
Sometime in the next 3 weeks, we are going to do a session on how did the liver do in this election. And one of the things I want to do when we talk about that election is the degrading of common truths, right? Because what you just described works a lot better in a society where when somebody knowledgeable and scientific makes a statement and it's well-grounded and it's non-judgmental, everybody says yes, as compared to some of what we see in the States and frankly in the UK, which is very different from that.
Absolutely. But a lot of people it's this whole thing of we don't want to be a nanny state. We don't want to tell people what to do or what they shouldn't do. The trouble is that premise only works if all of those people have the right information and then make those choices. The fact that most people don't have that information means that the whole premise is flawed. So
Mary, you want to come back when we talk about did the liver win the election? How did the liver do in the election?
Yes, I'll try to keep my temper down. But yes, I will.
Well, we're going to get Don also, and there are going to be all of us on one side and Stephen on the other side. It'll be a lot of fun.
I think that'd be great. I think it's, as Louise said, I think what we need is, to educate people to know what the ramifications of the choices that they're making and not to mandate them to make these choices. We do need a healthier society. It's a cost to all of us, really.
Yep. And we're an hour and a half in, so I'm going to start to wrap up. To those of us who are listening, we'll be letting you know next week what the next few weeks are going to look like. But there will be one episode where we're going to bring Ian Rowe back to talk about this issue of the linkage between cardiovascular death and between CVD and NASH, and a different way of looking at some of the analyses that have been done recently that suggest that might not be as big an issue as we had previously believed. And we're going to do one issue on this topic, which is how did liver fare in the political environment of the U.S. in the fall and the UK really throughout the year. You guys have had an interesting time also. With that, I want to go to the conference wrap-up version of the last question, which is coming out of everything that's happened this week at AASLD, what are one or two things, and here I will go one or two, that we think are likely to change, either in terms of how a specific player behaves or what we think about or what the society knows? Brave one, go first.
I'll jump in. I suppose the one thing I would like to see change on some of the stuff that's happened during ARSL and also EASL and the good work that Donna and all of those areas do is to have at least one country have a NAFLD policy to start treating what is a pandemic in their own regions. Just one. We will broaden the how did the liver do in the election conversation to take into account the NASH bill that was introduced in Congress this week that Donna talked about recently. Yeah.
Duly noted. Next.
I mean, I just think this has been as bad a year as it's been for many people. I think it's been a good year for NASH therapeutics. And so I come away, I think, with a sense of optimism that I hadn't had in a while. So I'm really excited about the future of NASH therapeutics.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think we have seen a year of positive impact on drug development as opposed to 2019, which was something I'm glad is in the rearview mirror. And I think it sets up nice for 2021. One area I think we need to do a much job in is disease state awareness. We, for whatever reason, are not getting the message out to patients. We're not getting the message out. If we could just do 10% better than what we're doing now, we imagine the number of lives we would be able to impact that wouldn't just wait till they're jaundiced to show up at the emergency department. And I think, to me, that's the one thing that we can impact the most, and we should be impacting the most, is just making patient patients and physicians aware of the disease. I'd like to see more of that before the next liver meeting.
I think it's an excellent point. And mine is, I don't just think it's been a good year for drug development, although it has. I think that there's been a lot of insight creation around what actually is going on in the liver, and that's leading to better drug development, is leading to some better thinking about diagnostics and a more integrated view of what we're supposed to do next. And I think that's huge because, you have years like 2019, in part because people were throwing darts at the wall, or they're trying to hit a target, and the target they're trying to hit is either artificially constrained or just not right. The more we understand about how all the pieces go together, it's why the consulting firm is called Hep Dynamics, my consulting firm. The more we understand how the pieces go together and dynamically how things work, the easier it is to figure out what targets make sense, how to put them together, and it's easier to learn. And really, this is all about learning. It's about learning how to treat. It's about learning how to design drugs. It's about learning how to take care of ourselves. We are woefully under-informed at every level about liver, but boy, it does feel at the development levels, drug diagnostic, et cetera, like this year has been miles ahead of last year, just miles. Education, I agree with you, Stephen, Mary, Louise, all of us, that needs work, but the drugs, it feels like we're doing better. With that, let's wrap up. Tomorrow night, we will be getting together again, although you're not going to hear it until Thursday, to do our So What Did We Learn This Week session. We will, because we had so much fun with Jorn Schattenberg and Vlad Ratziou after EASL, we will have them back. The health of debate, I think, will go up about 2 levels even from this, which has been fantastic. And this will drop on Tuesday, that will drop on Thursday, and then next week we're debating what to do because of U.S. Thanksgiving. We'll let you know, and we'll be publishing a schedule of what we're going to do the following weeks. With that, let me thank Louise for giving us 3 evenings, 2 late nights and then 1 evening in a row. It's only 11:20 in the UK right now. You must feel positively fresh as a daisy. And Stephen and Maru and everybody who's been with us these last 4 days, I think it's been a fantastic conference, a great set of podcasts. I'm excited to hear how people respond to them. And with that, let me thank everybody on this team. Mike Wilson, who's been up till 4 a.m. Memphis time the last 2 mornings, getting episodes out to you folks by mid-morning. I think he's going to be able to get some sleep tonight, and then tomorrow he'll be back to normal. Eric Rounds, who then gets up really early so we get these things posted. Palateo Lay, who work with everybody on soundtracking. And most of all, everybody who listens to this podcast, who sends us notes, and who somebody reached out to Manal Abdulmalik last week and said, hey, I heard you on episode 33 of the podcast. You sounded really interesting. Can I ask you a question? When those things happen, it just makes all this work a lot better for all of us. So thanks, surfers. Thanks, support. Thanks, audience. Stay safe. Surf on. See you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
Drug developers, investors, researchers, and corporate executives wrestle weekly to understand what is happening in commercial development of NASH medications. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Stephen Harrison, patient advocate Donna Cryer, liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, and forecasting and pricing guru Roger Green as they discuss the issues affecting the evolving NASH market from their own unique perspectives on the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast.